coming to you live from Sam's basement, Abstract Expressionism, starring Allison Schendel,
Amanah Fatima,
Samantha Faris.
So, Abstract Expressionism began in the early 1940s and continued on into the early 50s. Major contributors to the movement were artists such as Jackson Pollock, William de Kooning, Franz Kline, and Mark Rothko. Many of the artists were situated in Greenwich Village in New York City.
New York City was pretty much the new Paris of art. It was very important to this art movement.
Abstract Expressionism was one of the more post-war art movements, and it was very influenced based off of the entire World War II post-New Deal kind of era. And many of the artists such as Pollock and Rothko and these people, they felt as though the previous art styles were not adequate enough to express this post-war era.
Right, I totally agree, and I feel like the way that they made their art totally portrayed the way they felt about the war and everything that was going on during that time period.
This entire art movement is very based on expressing the inner psyche.
Yeah, they all kind of use a kind of archaic art for their inspiration, and they use the primitive cultures and what happened in the war to try to put it into their paintings and show how they were feeling. A major influence of abstract expressionism was cubism, which is pretty much the movement which there was a whole bunch of geometric shapes and they're used in the painting, and all of the shapes have a meaning. And you can see that here in William de Kooning's painting, where all of the shapes are kind of geometric and very thought out.
Yeah, when you look at de Kooning's paintings, it's very organic shapes, and then when you look at Franz Kline's, it's very organic brush strokes and it's pretty much just action painting, and it just every brush stroke and every shape they make has a meaning and has a purpose on their painting.
And Sam, you just mentioned action painting. I think that's a very defining technique in abstract expressionism, and you can definitely notice that in Jackson Pollock's painting right here, number 8. Action painting, it's basically the artist puts himself or herself within the painting. It's very continuous lines, and the technique itself is just as important. The painting technique is just as important as the painting itself.
When you look at all these paintings together, you can tell that they are not stiff lines and shapes, that they are very flowing and very, you can tell that the artist was moving. When you look at Franz Kline's, you can tell that his arm was going in all different directions and purposely going in all different directions. And then when you look at Pollock's, it was this exact same thing.
Pollock's was especially, he described his paintings as being order and chaos at the same time. There was definitely a very, defined duality present in his paintings, and that was totally intentional. Later on in this presentation, we're going to see a video of Pollock in action, literally doing action painting.
Yeah, I really agree with you, Amanah, about Jackson Pollock's painting here. You can see that his arm is constantly moving, and he has a plan set out of what he wanted to do, but you can't really tell if he was finished or he wanted to add something more to it.
Pollock himself said in his paintings that there was a definite skeleton present as he painted. And here in number 8, you can see that there is a continuous line, the black line, that kind of centers around the painting, and it goes around, and he essentially painted the rest of number 8 around it, the red and white splotches you see. They were kind of paint splatters. He would just literally take his paintbrush and then he would splatter it everywhere, and wherever it went, it was intentional but not intentional. And one of Jackson Pollock's quotes about his painting art style was, "I control the flow of the paint, there is no accident." And you can definitely see that within number 8 as well as other paintings as well.
I really like that quote, but let's not forget about how important the color use is in all these paintings.
Agreed. I mean, as you can see, Jackson Pollock especially, he uses very earthy colors.
Whoa! I'm gonna let you finish, but Franz Kline had one of the best color schemes of all time.
Yeah, because he only used black and white.
So the first artist that we will be analyzing in this presentation is Jackson Pollock. And I would say out of all the abstract expressionists, he is perhaps the most iconic, especially for his splatter paintings such as Autumn Rhythm and Lavender Mist. However, many people don't realize that many of his earlier paintings were more so influenced by his early childhood and studies under artists such as American regionalist Thomas Hart Benton. Here we see the painting Going West, which was painted from 1934 to 1935, and you can definitely see the clear influences that you had from Pollock's childhood. He was actually born in Cody, Wyoming, and later on in his life he moved to Greenwich Village in New York to study under Benton. While studying under Thomas Hart Benton, he began his own career as a regionalist painter, and his works from this time reflect both hardships of his early life and the situation which tens of thousands of failed farmers faced due to the Great Depression.
As Amanah pointed out, in Going West, Pollock's painting was influenced by his early childhood experiences. In addition to that, a lot of his earlier paintings were influenced by revolutionary Mexican artists, such as Jose Clemente Orozco, and were figurative but had themes which he returned to as an abstract expressionist, such as Moonlight. His treatment of paint was tempestuous, bordering on violence.
As Allison said, Pollock incorporated Orozco style into his work by painting scenes of ritual violence that contained Native American, totemic, and pictographic motifs, as well as animal and human bones and anatomical parts.
Pollock believed that primitive art, such as Native American art, offered a view into the unconscious, and this was a link to physical and spiritual harmony. Works such as Totem Lesson 2, painted in 1945, shown here, was strongly influenced from these ideas, as well as Navajo sand paintings, which Pollock encountered during his time in the American West. Pollock's exposure to Native American art early on piqued his curiosity in mythological concepts.
Pollock experimented both with Greco-Roman and Native American legends as influences for his work. Pasiphae, painted in 1943, is an example of former and depicted themes such as bestiality and violence. The subject is the Minotaur, and Pollock used savage brushwork to express the bull's lustful actions.
Some of Pollock's later works, such as War, which was painted in 1947, also reflect the early imagery which was found in his earlier works. For example, here you can clearly see that there is a falling figure as well as a bull in the center/top of the painting. In addition to this, the destruction of war is shown by the graphic imagery of hooded and disembodied figures around here and here, and it's meant to show the universal horror of war. Certainly, I believe that this painting especially, it was in a response to the horrors that were witnessed by many of the people in World War II. Do you guys agree?
I totally agree.
Yeah.
It shows that, it shows that they're kind of rebelling against what the war was. They're showing people that it wasn't a good thing.
Yeah, and this is a lot more chaotic than a lot of Pollock's other pieces, and he's really famous for a lot of his splatter paintings, but this one is a lot more detailed, but has a lot more chaotic and has a darker side to it.
And Allison, you say chaos, and like I said earlier in this presentation too, I believe, but Pollock's goal in his art was definitely to show these oppositions, such as order and chaos, reason and passion, modernism and primitivism. And you can see here, the order exists in the defined lines and whatnot. He camouflaged some of the images with linear motions and darkened and thickened them with red and yellow pencil, which you can see around here and here. You can definitely see a lot of that pencil work that was done. And with that pencil, he added to the dramatic intensity of the overall painting. And definitely the chaos exists obviously in this jumbled strokes you see. Do you guys agree?
Yeah, I agree. In the corners, you can tell that there's a lot of scribbles, and you can tell, they're there for a reason, but you can tell there's just a lot of chaos in it. But also, the colors are really important, because the reds and the yellows, to me, they seem like blood would be the red, and fire would be the yellow, and it's just they're such deep, important colors.
And again, here we see the imagery as we saw earlier on in Pasiphae with the bull with the lustful actions and whatnot. Here, however, the bull and the nude figure take on a slightly different meaning, because this figure and the bull in the center relate to a nude figure and bull from a sketch that Pollock did earlier on in 1938.
Yeah. I think this painting is really influential in this time period because it is a post-war era, which is when abstract expressionism was going on. I think that a lot of people could relate to this painting.
And going off of that entire post-war era concept, remember guys that abstract expressionism, it came up in the first place as a response to World War II, and because many of these artists such as Pollock felt that the previous generation's artwork were inadequate for expressing what this new post-war generation was feeling. And definitely this chaos that you see here and the violence and straight up gore that you see in this painting is definitely being reflected. And I feel as though Pollock, when he was painting this, he was definitely thinking of what people such as the Germans and Hitler, the Nazi people, in general, they did during the World War II time, and the bombings at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and overall this general depression that was existing in this generation at this time. He just really let it all out in a very cathartic kind of style.
I also agree, because when you look at this, there's only one figure, and I feel like he's combining all these different nationalities that are fighting together in this one figure.
Yeah, he's trying to make them all try to stand together.
Yeah, like we were all equal in that fight, and we were all doing bad things to each other. And I think he's just trying to represent that in that one figure.
This painting makes me feel sad. It
Yeah.
makes me feel very sad.
It makes me feel confused and kind of upset.
In Greenwich Village, Pollock learned a lot from Hans Hofmann about European modernist tradition. He also became obsessed with Picasso, particularly his painting Guernica.
Also, while staying in Greenwich Village, studying under Thomas Hart Benton, Pollock learned to do sketches analyzing old master paintings using geometric shapes, lines, and shadows. These sketches, dating from the late 1930s to early 40s, were a big influence on his later art, according to his wife Lee Krasner.
The Cubist influence brought on by Picasso and these other European modernists concerning geometric shape, line, and shadow are clearly seen in works such as Bird, which was painted from 1938 to 1941, in the sense that you have a lot of symbolism going on as well as psychological undertones. Something to remember about Jackson Pollock when studying about him is that throughout his life he was a very intense and unhappy person who poured his anxiety literally out onto his paintings, and this can be seen in many of his later on paintings too, such as Lavender Mist and Autumn Rhythm, which were more of the splatter variety. He was strongly tortured by these questions of identity and unsure of himself and his relationship with his art. And this unsurety is what actually led him to be influenced by psychologist Carl Jung and notions of the unconscious. And from 1939 to 1942, he produced hundreds of symbolic drawings aimed at therapeutic psychic release and self-healing. Among art historians, there is controversy as to whether Pollock's depicted symbols were directly derived from Jung's diagrams.
In 1949, Pollock was named the greatest living painter in the United States by Life magazine, but he was also ridiculed by some as Jack the Dripper.
Oh no! Oh!
The extensive coverage, both celebratory and cynical, in the art world and mainstream press made Pollock and the movement famous and gained critical acclaim. Also, in this painting, Autumn Rhythm, he made it in October 1950 when Pollock was at the peak of his fame during his career. It was non-representational painting.
The painting's spontaneity is important, but that does not mean it's utter chaos. This is an element of control. Pollock said himself, "I control the flow of the painting. This is no accident."
The painting shows the process by which it was painted, which is characteristic of many abstract expressionist paintings because they use a style called action painting. The dynamic visual rhythms and sensations, which are buoyant, heavy, graceful, arcing, swirling, and pooling lines of color, are direct evidence of the physical choreography of applying the paint with the artist's new methods, which you will see in this clip right now of Jackson Pollock painting Autumn Rhythm.
A method of painting is the natural growth out of a need. I want to express my feelings rather than illustrate them. Technique is just a means of arriving at a statement. When I am painting, I have a general notion as to what I am about. I can control the flow of the paint. There is no accident, just as there is no beginning and no end. Sometimes I lose a painting, but I have no fear of changes, of destroying the image. Because a painting has a life of its own, I try to let it live.
In Autumn Rhythm, there is no central point of focus. The entire surface is significant because, as you saw in the clip, Pollock worked with the canvas on the floor and he constantly moved around it while applying paint from all four sides. The painting itself is 207 inches wide and assumes the scale of the environment. It gives the feeling of being enveloped by the painting as you view it, and this was Pollock's intention. When painting Autumn Rhythm, Pollock first made a linear skeleton using black paint. Since this initial layer was diluted, it soaked through the unprimed canvas. Over this, Pollock then created wells of white, brown, and turquoise lines, which you see in the painting. The painting evokes nature, and not just because of the title. The coloring, horizontal orientation, and sense of ground and space all contribute. Of all of Jackson Pollock's splatter paintings, I would say that Autumn Rhythm is perhaps his most famous and iconic.
In the most literal of sense, this painting is named Autumn Rhythm, and it does, like, if you look at this painting, it does seem like there's a sense of rhythm going throughout, like how he splattered the paint onto the canvas. Although it's like looks chaotic, it's kind of organized chaos, going back to what we've been saying earlier. Like all the colors, there is an even distribution of colors all throughout the painting, even though there is more of a heavy set of black. Every color is at every point on the canvas.
I totally agree with that, Allison. As well as that, you can also see that there's a sense of continuity within this painting. And I think that really pertains to this whole idea of how it's in a very like transcendentalist idea, I would say, of how like we are continuous with nature and those kind of ideas.
It's also very symmetrical, like that's the order in it, but like it's so chaotic because there's just lines everywhere and it's like you place them there for a reason, and it is just a really great painting.
Also, as you can see that this was an action painting, the objective was an actively painted surface, which would allow Jackson Pollock to say that even though he was the subject painter, his subject was the process of painting itself. And that is what characterizes action painting. It's the process that becomes just as important as the subject of the painting. And although the subject here is very ambiguous, it was the process which you saw earlier, which is what makes this painting so significant. Some other of Pollock's splatter paintings that gained fame were Lavender Mist, painted in 1950, and Blue Poles, painted in 1952. Just like Autumn Rhythm, these paintings also utilized the whole action painting technique. And during this time period, from 1947 to 1950-ish, Pollock produced about 140 paintings, many of which were mural-sized, and he mostly did large-scale drip paintings on an unstretched canvas on the floor, using techniques such as dripping, pouring, and splattering. And you can definitely see the entire influence of these techniques here in Lavender Mist, as well as Blue Poles. Throughout his career, Pollock used a variety of media, from pencil and color pencil, chalk, pastel, crayon, to tempera, watercolor pencil, ink, wax, enamel, and metallic paint. He also used, in addition to conventional drawing stock, cardboard, handmade, rag paper, laminated wrapping paper, rice paper, sketchpad covers, and typing paper. Pollock purposely created work not meant to stand the test of time, and he worked with impermanent materials by combining oils, house paints, industrial enamels, and aluminum. In fact, many museums today report problems with preservation of abstract expressionist paintings for this very reason. Throughout his life, Pollock struggled a lot with alcoholism. He was a chronic alcoholic and diagnosed by one doctor as schizophrenic. He used his paintings, as I mentioned earlier in this presentation, as a way to self-heal, and was successful for some time during that period from 1940 to 1950, and very productive too.
During the last 5 years of his life, which was 1952 to 1956, Pollock was troubled artistically and personally. He produced a few works of art. His drawings at this time took a more recognizable imagery, such as large heads which appear in his paintings after 1951. An example is the painting Deep. Usually the figurative references are obscured, but not always.
Jackson Pollock died very suddenly and tragically. He died in an automobile car crash in 1956 at the age of 44, likely under the influence of alcohol. His legacy continues to live on today through his famous paintings and as an iconic artist in this movement.
Starting with Rothko, his first painting made in 1944, The Slow Swirl by the Edge of the Sea. It's a very complex painting, not exactly in the meaning, but in the way he painted it. You can tell that the colors were super important. The way he used the brush stroke was super delicate, and the shapes are very prominent in here. And you can definitely see that there's two figures in this painting.
And speaking of the figures, you can also clearly see that they are women. And contrasting this with Rothko's later paintings, such as the Untitled works, which were mostly just large blobs and rectangles and whatnot, you can see that the figures here, like the stylistic evolution that occurred. And you can also compare this to de Kooning's paintings, correct, Allison?
Yeah, you can just see how William de Kooning often paints women, and the way he depicts them is kind of in a negative light with the shapes that he uses in the form of his brushstrokes, which is very similar to the paintings that Sam was talking about earlier.
Mark Rothko was very interested in mythological concepts. In the late 30s, he read Friedrich Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy and often said how much it influenced him.
Rothko wanted to create images that would evoke the tragic and timeless spirit of myth, which is generic to myths all throughout time. He wanted to express man's fears and destructive passions.
Going off what Amanah and Allison said about mythological concepts, the archaic idol, it shows a very violent scene with the arrows. You could see red arrows in it, and then it's painted with very broken brushstrokes, so it's kind of showing like a rough, like violent, like essence to it. And the colors used were very bright, but they're kind of, with the white that he used in it, kind of like brought them down a bit.
In addition to this, I would definitely say that this particular painting has a lot of similarities to some of Jackson Pollock's earlier works with his experimentation with Navajo art styles and whatnot. Here I would say on the right side of the painting you see a structure that looks very similar to a teepee in my opinion. Do you guys agree?
Yeah.
Yes.
The Native American influence, in addition to Mark Rothko's clear interest in mythological concepts, definitely has a clear interplay seen in this painting.
Also, there are two horizon lines. The one closest to the bottom it looks like there is land at the bottom and then there's water on top. And then there's a horizon line closest to the top. And it looks like the water hitting the sky. But, like, it also looks like there's, like, a black at the top. There's, like, a blackish, grayish, like, fog. It kind of looks like where, like, the clouds are hitting.
Yeah, I see what you're talking about. It's like all those, like, tan swirls at the top. It's almost like the wind is blowing.
And I'm sure many of you are wondering at this point why Allison, Sam, and I are kind of giving our own personal interpretations of these paintings. And the reason for that is abstract expression in itself as a movement, there were no really predictable art styles here. As in, like, central to these individualist post-war painters like Pollock and Rothko and whatnot, they veiled their paintings in a very privatized imagery, and you can see that clearly with the symbolism here. And they did it like very intentionally, and it was their purpose to make it hard to find an obvious and easy meaning. So there was a level of ambiguity within all these paintings, and you can see that here in Archaic Idol, in addition to some of other Rothko's and Pollock's and de Kooning's paintings.
I agree, Amanah, and also, like, the way this makes me feel, I feel like there is, like a very violent scene going on in front of the ocean. The way it makes me feel is very anxious, and it just looks like a very, like, violent, bloody type scene.
Yeah, like, so much is going on here. It's hard to put like a point on what you think is happening all around. It's just so much is happening.
For me personally, this painting definitely gives a sense of being out in the open west. Perhaps it's from the teepee and arrows and general Native American imagery that I am seeing in this painting. But in a sense, it's also kind of constricting with its very, like, warm colors and lack of, like, differentiation throughout the painting. There's symbolism here, and it's not like some of Rothko's later on paintings where you saw, like, the rectangles and general, like, blobs, basically.
Another one of Rothko's works is called, like, Untitled, which he's very famous for not titling his artwork. It was made in 1949, but when you look at this picture, you can tell that there's layers of paint. You can tell that he painted very thinly, and when you look at the white border, it looks like the painting is coming out at you, like the pink and orange and the yellow and the black squares are coming at you. And he also used turpentine rub, which later in the slide it'll show you what that is, but it makes the edges look as if the box is floating.
Another Rothko painting, Blue, Green, and Brown, painted in 1952. Don't you guys agree? It actually looks very similar to the other Rothko
Yes,
paintings.
it does.
Totally agree.
And you know, it's very interesting, especially because if I was first looking at his paintings, and when I first did, I thought they looked practically the exact same way. And Sam, it's really, like, I was wondering, why exactly is it that you haven't really mentioned color? Because that's usually what stands out in terms of how his paintings are different.
There's actually a quote, I can't get it word for word, but he did say that if you look at his paintings and look at the relationship between the colors and start to cry, then you truly do not know the meaning behind his pieces of work. Going along with what you were saying about the colors, he actually did use a lot of turpentine and poured it inside of his paint and mixed it to make the paint really thin. So he would put layers and layers of color on the canvas to give it like this depth and all this bright, vibrant colors.
And now this is number 14, painted in 1960 by Rothko, and you may think that we're showing you the same painting all over again, but nay, they are different.
You can tell in this one, actually, the brush strokes. You can tell in the orange that it is very choppy and very thin, and you can't really tell that in the blue, but you can really tell it in this one, and this is why I chose to talk about this one, because it's so much different from the others when it really doesn't look like it's so different. How do you guys feel about the painting?
Personally, when I look at this painting, I get really anxious because I feel like he spent a lot of time on different aspects of this painting, and I feel like he's trying to tell me something, but I just can't figure out what it is, and I'm getting really frustrated about it.
I actually really agree with you, Allison. And to be honest, like, I feel as though this is present in many of Rothko's works. There's, like, an element of, like, terror and tragedy, and there's just a really, like, oppressive atmosphere going here. And they have been described as a surrender to the void by art critic Charles Harrison as well.
If I saw this in person, by the way, abstract expressionist paintings are always made on very large canvases.
Right.
If I saw this in person, it would be
encompassing you. And that was definitely intentional on Rothko's part. He really wanted the viewer to be like surrounded by the painting. Like, for example, if you walked into the Museum of Modern Art in Chicago and you were viewing a Rothko painting, the painting would take up an entire wall, and that would be the only painting in the room. So it's a very encompassing experience.
Yeah, it's like a piece of art, and it makes you feel so so small, and it makes you feel just so
insignificant.
Yeah, but just by looking at this piece of art that's just so plain, but it actually just has so much meaning behind it. This Rothko painting is called Four Darks in Red, made in 1958, and this was near the end of his life. So I mean, the colors he used were pretty dark and ominous, and they weren't very they were still vibrant, but they weren't very happy. And when you look at this one, you can tell that the black looks further away from the rest of the rectangles, and he did this by making the turpentine rub on the black small and then the turpentine rub on the other purple ones a lot thicker, and this shows a lot of depth in his art. We're about to show you a clip of an artist painting a Rothko painting just like this using turpentine rub. So here you go.
Exactly how Rothko painted so thinly. Rothko would add so much turpentine to his paint that he would stain the canvas, less painting on the canvas than really pushing his paint into it as a stain. Because these stains are so thin, you're able to read one color quite literally through another. In thicker areas of paint, you see the overlayer. In thinner areas of that overlayer, you begin to see the underlayer. And because Rothko layered color over color over color, any given zone is infinitely complex.
This last piece, Rothko made this right before he died. It's called the Red Maroon Mural, made in 1959. And, I mean, it's pretty much made like the rest of them. It was painted very thinly with multiple layers. And in this one, I mean, it's different from the others. I mean, it was painted differently because, there isn't, a block. It kind of looks like he painted the back and then he put, a square around it. But, I mean, yeah, I mean, how do you guys feel about this one?
I think it's definitely more interesting compared to some of his earlier paintings because of that reason. There's a more central image here in the sense because you have that square in the middle. And the colors, this looks like it's black, correct? Right. And I mean, I would say like the black, it definitely stands out to me.
Yeah, it's also really weird that he made this very bright and only put like a little bit of black in it because he committed suicide right after this painting. So it's kind of like it kind of gives you like a weird vibe knowing that he made this during a deep time in his life.
Yeah, like I was just that's actually really curious because this painting makes me feel depressed. And I feel like a lot of people might think that it makes them feel depressed even without knowing that maybe he committed suicide. I think he wanted to have that effect on people.
Like if I were to walk up to this in a museum, it would be very hard to like sit there and just stare at it.
I agree with that, Sam and Allison. And also connecting back with some of Pollock's later works before he died and was returning to that alcoholism, I would definitely say like there's an ongoing theme here with all these abstract expressionists, you know? I mean, like, they really painted what they felt to an extent.
Yeah, I agree with that, Amanah, and it's like they rather than painting about the subject, they wanted to embody the mood of the subject that was given off. Also, when looking at this, it's not like you're looking at something very beautiful. It's kind of like they wanted to make something look very raw. They wanted to make it look like really real and like what they were feeling. They didn't want to make this look pretty. They wanted to show you what they were feeling and have you feel the same way.
In my opinion, this was a very like intimate artist towards his viewer interaction going on with these paintings. Although you see that the subject matter is not very complex and whatnot, it's the meaning behind the painting. Just as it is the meaning behind a lot of these abstract expressionist meanings that ultimately is more important.
Yeah, like Rothko's abstract was like really melancholic, and it was pretty much inspired by like the tragedies that was happening in his life and in the world. Also, during the 1950s, he started using dark undertones and rich textures that became a focal point of his art, and you can really see that in this picture.
And I think this definitely relates back to the depression and anxiety he was feeling in the last few years of his life.
Next artist that we will be discussing is William de Kooning. He was born in the Netherlands, and after finally traveling to Manhattan, he started out with commercial jobs in art, but then later moved on to doing abstract expressionism. De Kooning felt a really strong pull towards traditional subjects like women and landscape, but this came later in his career. In more of his earlier works, his style was like radically abstract, and it really combined cubism, surrealism, and expressionism, as you will see in the paintings that we show you. This first piece is called Queen of Hearts. De Kooning painted it over the course of 3 years, which is 1943 to 1946. This painting is really representational, but it's also really abstract. The face has been really dulled down, like you can really see how he physically went in and removed layers of the paint. You can also see that biomorphism is extremely present in this painting.
In this painting, you can tell that there's no continuous lines, but he definitely does make shapes. Like you can tell like where her breasts are, that he just draws circles, and that the arms look more masculine than they should, and like the neck, it's kind of more bulky and more elongated than what a woman's figure should look like.
Going off of what Allison and Sam just said about biomorphism and automatism were in general just a very big part of de Kooning's art, as seen here in Pink Angels, which he painted in 1945, the year that the atomic bombs were dropped over Japan and made, as de Kooning said, angels out of everybody. There is surrealist influence here, but it was the start of de Kooning's more radical biomorphic abstractions of the late 1940s.
This next piece is called Woman Sag Harbor, which de Kooning painted in 1964. This painting is actually really interesting because when de Kooning was designing his new studio, he ordered a certain kind of doors, and when the doors got there, they were made of hollow wood instead of solid wood, and William de Kooning did not like that. He wanted them to be a solid wood, so instead of returning the doors, he decided to paint on them. This Woman Sag Harbor piece is the most popular piece of his door series that he made with all those extra doors that he didn't really use. As you can see right here, a woman has like a fierce look on her face. Her teeth are like gritted, and it looks like she's pulling out her hair, like her elbows are up, and it looks like she's pulling out her hair in terror. And also in the right hand corner, you can see like a kind of a hidden high heel shape De Kooning always paints his women with high heels on or either in the picture because he says that he wants to get the women up and as tall as he possibly could. De Kooning once said, "Flesh was the reason oil paint was invented." This next piece is called Woman 1, and it was painted in 1950. This is part of William de Kooning's women's series. He's had 3 different women's series. William de Kooning was literally obsessed with painting women, and as you can see by this painting, it is not really in a positive light. He has very negative views on women, and he says that they irritate him. This painting has really, really broad brush strokes, and it has like really dense and large colors. The figure that you can see, it is very, very wide-eyed. It looks very scared, and this one actually took an abnormally long amount of time for him to complete. He kept adding things and taking away layers and just making it really more complex and more abstract. Going back to the figure's eyes, they kind of reflect the cultural idea that was part of that time period, that's post-war, and the fear for there to be power in women. And another thing that is really interesting about this piece is that William de Kooning was obsessed with mouths. He always talked about how the mouth was kind of his center on the canvas, so he could paint everything around that. And that he just thought that mouths were really interesting because he said that everyone used their mouths for everything.
Yeah, and going off of what Allison said earlier on about the ideas behind women during this time period, women at this time period, especially in the 1950s, it was a very conformist society, and the post-war dynamics surrounding gender, sexuality, and power are really reflected in this piece, and de Kooning definitely wanted to evoke those dynamics here. He once said women irritate him sometimes, and the paintings reflected the bombshell women of the 50s, but were made less threatening through tight undergarments in marriage. And speaking of marriage, he was actually married to painter Elaine de Kooning, but his marriage ended in divorce, as might be expected considering his ideas about women.
Also, by looking at this, he made the figure look so masculine by using these very organic shapes, and the brush strokes were super rough, and I think that's just the image he has of women, that they're just he uses just a vulgar mood. He just has a vulgar mood about him for women.
I feel like these lines made such intense imagery, and all the lines kind of swirled around the image, kind of making that where your eye catches first. And I feel like in a lot of his pieces, especially his women's series, you can see the use of cubism by seeing the kind of shapes that he uses to define the women not being very smooth.
Also, the colors that are used makes it look very exotic, and I don't know if anybody else can tell, but it kind of looks like there's a bird on her shoulder.
Yeah, kind of. Yeah.
And it just makes it look very exotic, kind of makes it look African.
You know, that's really interesting what you just said, Sam, because looking at these other painters again with the whole mythological aspect and whatnot, they were very interested in this primitive art. And
yes,
what you brought up with the African art and even oceanic and Aboriginal in general, it definitely evokes that kind of primitive theme that was seen in other abstract expressionists.
Yeah, I agree.
Looking at this piece, it just makes me feel kind of offended.
Same.
Yeah, it's just seeing how he depicts women and seeing how it's kind of in a negative light, it just makes me, as a proud female, to just not really know what to think about how de Kooning might have felt about me.
I agree. Same.
I'm not very offended by this. I think that this is a beautiful piece of work, and I think that, the artist should have their own opinion on what something should be like, and this is just his view of woman, and I mean, if he thinks that way, then, if you don't like it, then don't look at it, I guess, I could say, but no. I just think it's very beautiful.
Yeah,
the way he looks at woman.
And, connecting this back to, just modern art in general, that offensive quality that is present, Allison and I, we think it's offensive, while Sam doesn't think it's offensive. I think that entire quality itself, it's intentional, Yeah. And that's what defines abstract expressionism and modern art in general.
Because personally, people didn't think this was offensive. It wouldn't be so famous. He probably intentionally did this.
That's true. Also, going off of what Sam said about how, like, she doesn't think it's offensive, I think that is, like, it is interesting because even if me and Amanah think that it is offensive, I still think that it is a very powerful piece and it gets the point across, and as Sam said, that is why it is so famous, because it turned so many heads and got so many people's attention. As I may have discussed before, de Kooning's women's series was his most successful and popular series that he'd had. One of de Kooning's works is Untitled, and it was painted in 1948, and this was one of his paintings in his first solo exhibition. There's a lot going on in this painting. You can see there's lots of like grips and randomness, and there are so many vertical lines in this paper. It looks like complete chaos, but if you look really carefully, you can see that all the vertical lines are kind of behind the big fatter shapes, and it allows them to like kind of float together and be in the center of the canvas. And I just think this painting it's really beautiful, even though it's only in black and white. And it really propelled him to public attention in the late 40s. This is kind of what started his whole career. This next piece is called Whose Name Was Written Water, painted in 1975. This personally I think is one of the most interesting ones of de Kooning's works because of just the way that he began to modify his oil paints. He started adding non-drying oil to his regular oil paint so that the paint kind of stayed soft throughout the entire painting process. And this is a really distinct feature, and you can tell if you look closely at like the reds and the blues that when they were drying, the canvas began to like wrinkle a little bit. And it's also really apparent in this piece that he constantly was like moving around the canvas and turning it on different sides, because some of the drip marks are all pointing to the left, which indicates that at one point the left side of the painting was the bottom. And moving on to this next piece called Excavation, painted in 1950, there you can see there's just a lot going on in this one also. This was one of his largest paintings that he's ever done. He added so much detail and made it look sort of like a jigsaw puzzle. He said paintings shouldn't have lots of hot spots. They should kind of have stuff going on all around so that your eyes don't focus on one center point. But in this piece, like, it's kind of even, but the way he makes all of the shapes, it's sort of geometric, bringing back this whole cubism factor. And he has just a lot of like shapes, and it kind of all fits together like a jigsaw puzzle. Also, I think the name of this painting came from the fact that de Kooning loved walking around excavation sites in New York and just looking at them. And there is, in the center of this piece, towards like 2/3 of the way up, there's kind of like a triangular shape representing like a shovel. This shovel could have been part of the reason that he named this painting Excavation. De Kooning loved to see how the city was changing, and I think that that's really present in this piece. This final piece that we'll be analyzing by William de Kooning is Untitled, and it's from 1984. What's really intriguing about this piece is at this point in de Kooning's life, he had severe dementia, and he wasn't able to remember, and he was constantly falling in and out of delusions. This painting has more of a confident, airy, somber feel. It's a lot more pretty than a lot of the other paintings that we've seen.
Yeah, you can tell also that he layered all these lines. Like, you can see that there's slight lines underneath that are actually kind of look like they're fading away. But it's just the colors that he uses. He normally did use the pinks and the blues and the reds, but it just it's a lot more beautiful and a lot more elegant and just graceful gestures.
Mm-hmm. You can also see, I agree with you, Sam, you can also see there's so much open space, he's making do with less than what he has, and I think this really relates to him having dementia, because he is trying to make do with having less, and kind of more you say less of a mind, because he's just falling in and out of this dementia state.
Yeah, I feel this empty space is kind of like his mind, he's trying to piece things together, but he can't, because I kind of, when I look at it, it's kind of these lines represent things that he can remember and things of about his life. He remembered how to layer things, how he used to do, but the empty space is just things that have been forgotten.
Mm-hmm. How does this painting make you guys feel?
Sad, but it's really beautiful that it kind of makes me it's kind of this innocent joy feeling.
I agree really completely, because at this point, I look at it after all the other pieces of de Kooning that we've seen, and it's wow, this is a lot pretty. It's more airy and open, and it gives me more space to be happy, but it's also kind of sad. Wow, look at look at some of the talents that he had that he kind of lost with his dementia that he's not able to portray on the canvas anymore.
I agree.
Stylistically, comparing it to some of his earlier works, like the women's series and whatnot, you could see, like, in his women's series at least, like, there was a lot more, like, heavy painting going on over there, you know? Like, with the figures and whatnot. And here, it's just, like you guys said earlier on, it's very airy and flowing. And you can see, like, how in his later stages of life, he was just kind of, you know, like, almost...
Like lost.
Yeah, lost and giving in to his dementia, sort of. So the last artist we will be talking about in our presentation on abstract expressionism is Franz Kline. Now, unlike the other artists we discussed, such as Pollock and de Kooning and Rothko, Kline, he started out as much more of a traditionalist painter. Like, he had a lot more training, I guess, compared to the other artists. But later on in his life, he was influenced by artists such as William de Kooning, who he was actually very good friends with, and he began producing these abstract expressionist works. Kline started generalizing his subjects into a series of lines and planes beginning in 1946. This resulted in a semi-abstract style that was influenced by Cubism. His painting style from there on became more fluid and showed more influence from artists such as de Kooning, with his black and white abstractions. Franz Kline is probably most famous for these black and white abstractions, such as you see in Foursquare, painted in 1956, and Marion, painted in 1960. These black and white abstractions actually are what made Franz Kline become a very famous artist. Like, he became known as the black and white artist following an October 1950 exhibition. Characteristic of Franz Kline were the several tones of white paint he used to achieve surface texture, and often mixed commercial paint with artist paints, as seen in his work Painted Newsprint, which he did from 1940 to 1950. This work in particular was done in a double spread of a newspaper's Help Wanted ads, and the newsprint itself added an additional shade of white, which is now faded to orange due to time. One of the greatest influences in Franz Kline's works was his early childhood, which he spent in western Pennsylvania. The industry concept was very important in many of his works, and you can see that here in Chief, which was painted in 1950. Chief was actually the name of a locomotive Kline remembered from his childhood, and some claim it is the subject of this painting. Many viewers say that Kline incorporated machinery in his paintings, and the lines in Chief here, as you can see, imply speed and power as they rush off the edge of the canvas. It's a good example of action painting, even though Kline didn't really work that way. Chief in particular is meant to be abstract, an uneven framework of horizontals and verticals broken by loops and arcs. As Kline said about his paintings, "I paint not what I see, but the feelings aroused in me by looking."
Going off of what Amanah said, the handling of black and white paint can be interpreted as really emotional. The enamel paints create textural conflicts that reiterate the struggle of forces on the picture surface.
Abstract Expressionism as a movement began to lose popularity in the mid-1950s, just as the Abstract Expressionists felt right after post-World War II era that their movement, like the art from the previous generation, no longer was adequate enough to characterize the emotions of their time. People during the mid-1950s began to feel much the same way. Abstract Expressionism no longer began to reflect the times and the consumerism and materialism that was beginning to arise in society in the 1950s America. They felt that pop art and minimalism especially were more reflective of these cultural movements. However, many post-abstract expressionists still existed. Artists such as Nicolas Caron took spontaneous painting to heart, but still started out with a general figurative form. From there, they would go on in all directions. The overall prevalence of figures among these artists has increased. Still, the figures were imagined. Some people say that abstract expressionism cannot really be argued that it still exists in the modern context because they feel that it refers to a specific movement in a specific time.
However, as artist George Ortman says, as long as people are curious about the subconscious and wish to investigate it through art, abstract expressionism will continue to exist.